Anything you consider to put in a funding application, whether it's EU funding, Malta Enterprise, it has to be future-looking.
Malta being part of the European Union, the local authorities, when they come to issue new incentive schemes, they need to make sure that those schemes fall in line with the European Union frameworks.
Another important point to keep in mind is the actual cappings of the scheme. So each and every scheme will give you a maximum amount in terms of funding.
Particularly in the last revision was that lesser aid was being, in terms of aid intensities, was being approved to local businesses.
Welcome to PwC Trend Talks. In this episode, we will be discussing the topic of incentives. With me here to discuss this topic, I've got Svetlik Grima, who specializes in nationally funded incentive schemes, and Shaun Vella Bonello, who specializes in EU-funded incentive schemes. So, Svetlik and Shaun, thank you very much for being here with me today to discuss this topic. Quite an interesting one. So we'll be speaking about various forms of incentives, tax credits, cash grants, loan interest subsidies, and much more. Over the past years, there has been an increasing awareness on the various incentive schemes that are available, and many businesses see what is out there that they can avail of. Of course, here we're speaking about free money. So let's step into funding that is available. Shaun, if I can start with you. If I have a capital project and I wish to apply for funding, what is the key factor that I need to keep in mind, maybe prior to applying for any aid?
Yep. So correct, Mar. So as you're saying, at the moment there are a number of schemes that are available, so both EU funding and nationally funded schemes. However, one cannot just go and apply without taking into a number of key factors before deciding whether to apply for a specific scheme or not. And the first very important factor is what we call the incentive effect. So it's important to keep in mind that before deciding whether to go for a specific grant scheme, you have to keep in mind that you cannot have started that specific project. So it's important that anything you consider to put in a funding application, whether it's EU funding, Malta Enterprise, it has to be future looking. So this is all in the effort that in the absence of being awarded that grant, that project would not have taken place. So that is the first point one would have to definitely consider before kicking off any scheme.
And a very important one, because if you would therefore invest prior to applying,
exactly,
there could be the risk that you would lose out of funding. When it comes to funding, we have mentioned that there are various forms of aid. However, Malta, being an EU member state, would definitely need to abide by EU state aid laws in order to formulate its incentive scheme. So Malta doesn't have a blank card and can issue whatever schemes it would like to. What are these forms of frameworks that our national authorities will then have to follow?
Okay, Mar, agreed. As you rightly mentioned, Malta being part of the European Union, the local authorities, when they come to issue new incentive schemes, they need to make sure that those schemes fall in line with the European Union frameworks. In particularly, and the vast majority of the schemes nowadays fall either under the general block exemption regulations, what we usually refer to as GBER, or else the de minimis state aid rules. Maybe a more familiar terminology, the de minimis state aid rules. So very briefly, the GBER regulations does not stipulate a maximum capping, so to say. There is a capping, which is very, very high, but in terms of these regulations, what one would need to keep in mind, the aid intensity here most probably would be linked to the size of the undertaking, and in certain instances as well to the location where the project is being undertaken. On the other hand, with respect to de minimis, maybe we generally see a higher aid intensity rates, but there is a general capping of €300,000 over a period of 3 years per member state. And the 300,000 capping, in the case of the de minimis, it is calculated at a single undertaking level. So when considering whether you've reached the 300,000 or not, a business need to assess his aid, the aid he was granted, but as well those of other businesses which fall within the same single undertaking, mainly related companies.
Okay, so to summarize, the GBER allows for a quite high amount of aid when compared to the de minimis, and even more so, the de minimis aid, one needs to consider not what a company does on a standalone basis, but in consider it with its other group companies which may avail of de minimis aid. So my understanding is that there are various schemes which could fall either under the GBER framework or also under the de minimis framework. How does one keep track, particularly when you are a large group? The difficulty will become to keep track of the various de minimis aid schemes that the various companies will be availing of, and what could there be in order to ensure that this 300,000 limit is not exceeded?
Yes, it's not easy, particularly in structures which are a bit complex, or else where businesses within the same group does not have visibility what the other companies within the group are doing and what applications they are submitting, etc. Just a development from this aspect, as from 2026, it is expected that every EU member state will have a register, and this register will include all the minimis aid that is approved to undertakings within by that member state to the businesses operating in that member state.
That will help to ensure that this threshold is not exceeded.
That's what we hope.
And at least what we hope, exactly. Svetlik, you mentioned that under the GBER there is reference to the size of the undertaking, and under the minimis you've mentioned the term single undertaking. Do these relate to the same thing? Are there different definitions for it?
Yes, very important point, Maria. So for the size, to determine the size of the undertaking of the business applying, one would need to consider not just the applicant, so who's applying, but even companies which are related to the business applying. And by related, in this case, we are referring to 25% plus.
Okay.
And there's a whole computation then how to calculate it, because you need to take the data of the 50% plus in a certain way, the 25 to 15 another way, so it's a bit complex.
A very complex one, that's what I was going to say.
Yes, particularly when we have groups, structures which are big, so we have quite a number of companies within the same group. When it comes to the minimis, then, it's a different computation, because in that case, you just need to consider what we refer to as 50% plus, or other companies which have what we refer to a direct link. So they have control, and so on and so on. So there's a very detailed definition of what includes a single undertaking. But to come to your question, so are different computations when you're calculating the size and when you are calculating the 300,000 capping.
So we started off essentially with the incentive effect, and that is one of the factors that we need to keep in mind. However, when you dig deeper, and then other considerations seem to come to play. So first of all, we've been mentioning 300,000 when it comes to the minimis. Therefore, when one is seeing whether to go for national funding or EU funding and which particular schemes, one would possibly need to watch out for whether the 300,000 threshold is met or otherwise. From an EU funding perspective, Shaun, are they mainly the minimis schemes, or would you have certain schemes which fall under the GBER framework?
So exactly, Mar. So as Svetlik correctly explained, so there are these two state aid frameworks, and typically when you have a scheme, it either falls under one or under the other. So in the sense, sometimes that is beneficial because it gives you an element of flexibility. Just to give a few examples, for example, a popular scheme over the past 2 years when it comes to EU funding was the retrofit scheme, which is a GBER scheme. So over there, as you correctly said, that the grant amount could have even ran into millions. So over there, you have that benefit that when it's under the GBER program, you're typically going to get more aid, even though it's at a lower aid intensity. However, then you do have other schemes. Another one comes to mind, which I think has been probably the most popular scheme over the past few years, is the digitalization scheme. So that was purely, for example, under the minimis, where you get 50% of any costs that one would incur on any digital investments. However, over the past year, so I believe launched earlier this year, another very popular scheme called the SME Enhance, which gives funding to part finance any costs incurred on any equipment and machinery that one really needs to operate. They've introduced the option where one can choose whether to go under the minimis or GBER. So again, that gives the applicant even more flexibility.
Indeed.
The main difference between the two is that under the minimis, you would get a higher aid intensity, as Svetlik was saying before, so you would get 50% of the costs, whereas if you decide to go under GBER, you'd get a lower aid intensity depending on the applicant size. And typically this ranges between 20 to 30% of the costs you incur. However, at least that gives you flexibility from two sides. So if you've used up all your de minimis threshold, at least you have the option that you can go under GBER, even if you're going to get a lower grant amount. Or else, if there is another scheme, such as the digitalization scheme, which is only de minimis, and you want to keep your de minimis threshold for that specific scheme, then you can decide to go for GBER under the other one. So agreed, it's important to differentiate between the two and kind of assess under which it makes more sense to apply.
Indeed, that's the word, assess. So one needs to see what incentive schemes it can apply for in order to maximize the best way forward. So as you mentioned, sure, if I've got available de minimis, it pays me to go for a 50% aid intensity rate rather than going for a 20% under the GBER. So that's an assessment that needs to be done. The frameworks are similar for both national funded schemes and EU funded schemes. However, are there any particular points which differ between the two schemes, between the two administrating bodies?
So yes, Mar, I think the main difference between the two, so between EU funded and Malta enterprise schemes, is when it comes to eligibility, in the sense that recently, so from last January onwards, the managing authority in Malta that manages these EU funds introduced a new eligibility clause, that for an applicant to be eligible, the total investments that one would include in an application, when taken into consolidation, have to have at least a value which is equal to 2% of the applicant's net asset value. So this was, as I said, introduced very recently in an effort to try and restrict the funding to those who really need it.
Okay.
However, it's important to mention that this is purely on the company that is applying for the funding. So as Svetlik mentioned, so for example, when it comes to size, we take the entire group. However, here, when calculating this 2%, we only take the net asset value of the applicant company. Okay. So that's
beneficial.
Exactly. It's a key benefit and an important point to keep in mind. Another very important point is when it comes to the start of works. And this probably ties into the first point that I made when it comes to the incentive effect. So it is very, very important that until one gets formal approval, acceptance from the managing authority on the grant that they applied for, they cannot start the project or have any formal commitment such as deposits, contracts signed, etc. So that is typically always the case across EU funding projects.
So you cannot commit to anything.
Nothing at all. So no deposits made, no contract signed. So it's purely, ideally, obtaining quotations.
Okay.
And from a national funding perspective, then the case is very, very similar. There are only few exceptions where schemes allow companies, businesses to apply after the project has started, always within specific timelines. And very recently as well, something that Malta Enterprise introduced was the fact that one can apply for consent to start the works, even though approval has not yet been granted by the corporation.
The formal approval is not yet issued, okay.
So that may also provide a bit of flexibility to businesses to actually start the works before receiving the actual approval by the corporation.
That could help, particularly when businesses might have
strict timelines as well.
A strict timeline, exactly, and found the adequate supplier from whom to purchase, so that would be helpful. Svetlik, I'm going back to a point you mentioned with respect to the GBER, and reference was made to having an investment in an assisted region. What are these assisted regions?
Correct, Mar. So with respect to GBER schemes, and in particular when it comes to the national funded schemes, the INVEST scheme, it restricts companies to invest in some way or another in those regions that are qualified as assisted regions. Nowadays, in the current scenario, we're looking at assisted regions of around 70% of Malta's population. And basically, these assisted regions are made up of the touristic areas and the industrial estates, basically. And what is the difference here is that when in prior years or in prior schemes, so to say, you could have invested all over Malta. Now, because of this assisted regions concept, the aid intensity depends on where you are investing. So if you are investing in an assisted region, then in that case, you'll be entitled for a higher aid intensity. If you're investing in what we are referring to as a non-assisted region, then the aid intensity is lower than it could have been in an assisted region or not eligible at all.
Okay.
So this is also an important point to keep in mind, that businesses need to keep in mind when they are looking for schemes under which they can apply for a specific project.
If you had to give a ratio of how many assisted regions there are in Malta and Gozo, what would that percentage be? And I'm assuming that this is something which is also regulated from an EU perspective.
Yes, correct. So currently we are at 70% of Malta's population. So 70% of Malta, whole of Malta, including Gozo and Comino, of course, is considered as an assisted region.
So those 30% other localities which are not funded, this assisted region will be at a disadvantage when compared to the rest. So we have established that the aid is calculated. If it's not a de minimis aid scheme, it's calculated on the basis of a percentage of your investment costs. Are all costs considered eligible? What type of costs would be eligible for incentive scheme?
So basically, it depends on the scheme in this case. So if we are looking at a training grant, for example, you wouldn't expect a fixed asset to be an eligible cost. But if we're looking at a capital investment project, which would which would qualify in terms of any of the available schemes, then acquiring a fixed asset then would typically be considered as an eligible expenditure. So in this case, it depends on the particular scheme that a business is looking at and considering to apply, basically.
And are these eligible expenditures consistent between the two managing authorities? So if I am going to invest in a facility and I need to acquire the premises, I need to finish up the premises, I need to acquire the machinery, I can either choose multi-enterprise incentive schemes or EU-funded incentive schemes for this type of project?
So I think over there again, so tying into what Svetlik was saying, it very much depends on the scheme. So typically, you would have a set of eligible items that would qualify under multi-enterprise schemes, whereas maybe they would not qualify under EU funding. So again, more
different costs, you're saying.
The importance around assessing again.
Correct.
I don't know if we can maybe give a basic example with a hotel. I don't know, construction costs are typically not considered for funding under EU funded schemes, but there may be schemes which give grants to them under multi-enterprise. Another important development that I'd also like to mention is on the concept of replacements and new equipment. So again, very recently, when it comes to EU funding, and I believe it's also the case at a Malta enterprise level, is that most schemes are restricting giving funding when the eligible expenditure is considered to be like-with-like replacement. So again, just to put it into a bit of perspective, if one is applying for the digitalization grant and they're purchasing a laptop purely to replace the one that they currently have because it's outdated, over there funding is not going to be awarded because it's purely a direct like-with-like replacement. However, on the other hand, if I don't know, you have a staff cohort of 5 people and you're expanding to 10 people and you need to purchase 5 additional laptops, then those 5 additional laptops will qualify for funding. So I think that's an important assessment that one has to take into account before applying.
So if I had a machine and just going to replace it with a like-for-like machine, unfortunately, that is not an investment project. Which would be eligible under these funding schemes.
The key requirement is always that the items you include in an application have to give you an additional benefit. So if you're purely replacing a laptop with another one with the same specs, functionalities, etc., over there the company as such is not gaining anything. So that is the thought process behind it.
So you've mentioned, Shaun, that in your example of the hotel, there could be costs which are not eligible under EU-funded schemes, but they could be eligible under multi-enterprise schemes. So in such a case, is it just that I need to apply only under multi-enterprise schemes because I qualify there and I would not be able to benefit from EU-funded schemes, and maybe such schemes can offer me a higher percentage rate?
So no. So the idea is to try and maximize funding as much as possible. So applying for one grant scheme does not restrict you for applying under another. It is very important to keep in mind that you cannot apply for the same item under 2 different applications. So over there, we touch upon the concept of what we call double funding. So again, if you're setting up a hotel and I don't know, you're setting up your restaurant or catering area, if you wish, you can, for example, purchase the tables and the chairs under an EU funding scheme, and I don't know, maybe the actual catering equipment, kitchen equipment under a Malta enterprise scheme. So that is completely acceptable, and it is something that ideally one does in an effort again to maximize funding. But the key point that one always has to keep in mind is that you cannot request funding for the same item
cost.
more than once.
So here we're saying that an assessment needs to be done, not just if you go for GBER and the minimis as we started off, but also how to mix the schemes to try to take the maximum benefit.
Yes,
but is it just simply looking at the schemes and saying 50% under this scheme, I'll take 20% under another scheme? Or is there an overall capping that one must adhere to?
Yes. Then there is what we refer to as the aid intensity for the project.
Okay.
So as a whole, then one would need to also assess that overall the aid intensity applicable to that project has not been exceeded when adding the two schemes, the aid granted in terms of the two schemes together.
Quite a number of assessments, not quite a straightforward exercise.
Not at all.
Okay, so even more so, we've got a percentage rate applicable for the schemes. We've got an overall aid intensity. Is there anything else that one should watch out for, or is it just merely computing the percentage rate with its eligible expenditure that will be incurred on an investment project?
So unfortunately there's always something else to consider, and another important point to keep in mind is the actual cappings of the scheme. So each and every scheme will give you a maximum amount in terms of funding. So for example, again going back to the digitalization scheme, even though it falls within the de minimis regulation, and over there you can get a maximum of 300,000 over a period of 2 years, under the specific scheme you are still restricted to a maximum grant amount of 120,000 at 50% aid intensity. So even though a scheme is regulated by the de minimis regulation, it does not mean that you can just take the full 300,000 from that one scheme, but you have to consider the maximum cappings from each and every scheme, which ties back into the point that we were saying that it's really, really important to keep track of what schemes a company is
availing of course,
applying for. In addition to that, it's also important to keep in mind that some exclusions do exist when it comes to eligibility in applying for these schemes, whether it's specific sectors or especially when it comes to company sizing. So unfortunately, when it comes to large enterprises, most of the time they are restricted from these sort of funding schemes. It does not mean that there are never schemes which such large companies can avail from. So very recently, as I mentioned, there was the retrofit scheme and the digitalization scheme, which were two very relevant schemes and popular ones, where large enterprises were considered eligible. However, most of the time, this sort of aid is targeted more towards SMEs. So that is also a key point to keep in mind.
Just a small point maybe on the large undertakings from a national funding perspective, there are options with a number of conditions, but there are options. So even when it comes to training grants, so it's an invest scheme, business development. So there are options. So again, assessment, I believe,
quite a number of assessments is in order
important.
To determine which
Yep.
scheme one should go
Correct.
for, or whether one should go for a mix of schemes to
As well.
maximize
as well.
the benefit.
Maybe another point that businesses should keep in mind is the type of aid. So certain schemes offer only a tax credit, for example. Other schemes cater for only reimbursement of costs, so a cash grant. And some other schemes also cater for a mix of both, or an option to choose whether to go for a tax credit or a cash grant. So what is important to understand what the business really needs in terms of aid, so it will help him choose under which scheme to apply
for. Very good. So, okay, I have my investment project, I haven't committed to anything, and I have established which scheme or schemes, a mix of schemes, I will be applying for. What is the process then? How should this be carried out?
Okay, so this is where the fun starts. So it's the application process, basically.
Okay.
So one would need to first determine whether you're applying for a Malta enterprise or EU-funded schemes, and then every authority has its own process to trigger the application process. So most probably you'd need to log in online, create an account, download an application, and start the process. Then once it is submitted, then it's at the managing authority to review, to assess, and to come back to the business with either further requests or else with the approval that the application is approved.
The part to celebrate.
Yep.
And once I've got this letter from the authority saying that I have been awarded the aid, I can just claim the aid. How does it work that way? Is it a final step, or are there other processes that need to follow?
So again, other processes. So it's important again to mention that it is only then when you get that formal approval, it is at that point in time that you can start actually purchasing the items that you included in your application for funding. However, once you purchase the item, it does not mean that you can go straight to the managing authority asking for the cash reimbursement or the tax credit or whatever the aid is. So there is another process to follow. So first and foremost, you have to implement the project. So if you've included 5 line items in your application for funding, you first have to purchase those 5 line items, make sure that they've been purchased, delivered, and set up and operational. And then at the end of the project, once it has been fully completed, we can move to the next stage, which we call the claim for reimbursement stage. So that is the point where you go to the managing authority, submitting all the documents that are required. And these typically involve documentation such as proof of payments, invoices, photographic evidence, etc. So it is important to keep in mind that as you are doing the project, there are certain documents that you have to collect, because eventually you will be presenting them to the managing authority. And once you submit your claim, there's again a period of assessment that the managing authority would carry out. And if everything is in order, you'd basically receive the funding.
It is at the claim stage where I can go to the managing authority and tell them to give me the money, literally back.
Exactly.
Maybe one small point which I forgot to mention is that generally the approval letter includes a number of conditions that one would need to satisfy in completing the project that was approved. And those conditions are crucial in then receiving the aid. So reading through the approval letter and making sure that all conditions are being satisfied, that's very important, basically.
And maybe in addition to that as well, it's also important to keep in mind that initially you have to fork out all the costs yourself. So even though you are getting 50% of the cost back, for example, it does not mean you're getting it straight away, as we are saying. So first, you're going to pay
Get
for
the
the entire
100%.
project yourself, and then
Get
at
reimbursed.
the end you're going to get reimbursed. So that's an important point to keep in mind from a cash flow perspective, especially.
Very interesting and a bit of a lengthy process.
Yes.
But as we mentioned, this is free money, so
Yep.
there must be compliance.
It's worth the
with,
effort at the end of the day.
Exactly. Where do we go from here? So we know that there are certain incentive schemes at the moment. What's in the near future are we thinking that could happen?
Yes, so basically the current schemes are based on the GBER and the de minimis state aid rules. Both these rules are up for revision in the coming years. So the GBER, which is up for revision in 2027, and then the de minimis state aid in 2030. So from a de minimis perspective, maybe we have a bit more time.
Of a breather.
But from a GBER perspective, this is closer to now, basically.
And what has been the trend over the years when it comes to these new regulations being issued?
What we have seen, particularly in the last revision, was that lesser aid was being, in terms of aid intensities, was being approved to local businesses, and this is basically because of how the economy of Malta was at the time.
So there could be the risk that with the revision of the new EU frameworks, Malta might be at a good GDP performance, which could affect the amount of aided grants, and the 70% Svetlik that you mentioned might risk
lower.
at being reduced further.
Yes.
So at this point, one should see what there is. If one
Maybe now
already
is the
has,
time.
now is the time. And what are the deadlines that we are looking at under the current schemes?
So from a national funding, from a Malta enterprise perspective, it depends if it is a de minimis scheme or a GBER scheme, but looking at the GBER schemes, the deadlines, the latest deadline is the September 2026. So one would need to apply by September 2026 for projects that will be starting by 31st December of 2027.
Okay.
From our end, it's quite similar, just a bit before. So at the moment, most of the schemes are open up to June 2026. However, this again is always subject to the availability of funds. So every scheme is given a pot of funds. So if that is drawn up before June 2026, then that grant scheme can be closed down.
Okay.
So again, I think we're at the right time for companies to actually consider what projects they have in the pipeline and see what scheme they can go for.
Can apply for. Thank you very much both for your time. A very interesting topic, and I think a point that we could take and give to our listeners out there is keep in touch with your advisors, see what is available out there to try to maximize the benefit that you can take on your investment project. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.